Hello, this Science of Sport video focuses in on the BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences Unit 2 Functional Anatomy specification, looking specifically within the skeletal system and on the learning aim D3, location of skeletal bones. And I've divided this D3 topic into two parts. This part looks at types of bone. So possibly from BTEC or GCSE, you may be aware that there are 5 different types of bone, and we need to get into the structure of these and the jobs, the functions that they have. Through all the anatomy, structure and function are very strongly connected. Things are built with a certain job in mind. Now these 5 types of bone are categorized by their shape. Okay, so not necessarily by their size, but by their shape. These also, as I said, you may be familiar with. So long, short, flat, sesamoid, and irregular. For each one of these bones or these types of bones then, I've tried to divide it into structure and function with some examples at the bottom. You will absolutely need to know this information and be able to give examples of them. So let's make a start. Long bones. If you've watched previous videos from this unit and this so far, you'll know the structure of long bones already. So D1 was about bone structure and bone anatomy, and we looked very specifically at long bones. But just as a recap, a long bone has the long shaft part of the bone, which is the diaphysis, and the end parts, which are the epiphyses. We've also got this outer protective layer, the periosteum, and then the last couple of components, the blood vessels that provide nutrients for this living bone. Bones are living, and the cartilage, so there's cartilage on the end of the epiphysis to try to reduce friction and wear and tear when moving with other bones. Long bones typically, as we all see, are structured for movement. And there's bone marrow inside, which provides us with nutrition. So the yellow bone marrow is a store of fat. The red bone marrow in the gaps in this spongy bone tissue is where red blood cells are made. So that's the sort of structure. Now these bones are structured and are long in order to act as levers where they joint together. So typically we find these long bones on our limbs, our appendages, and collectively our limbs are called our appendicular skeleton. And it's our limbs and the movements around the joints of our limbs that enable us to move and do a lot of the sporting actions that we perform as skills in the sports that we play. We obviously have to support our body mass, so these limbs and long bones are often the load-bearing bones, so the long bones of our leg, for example, support our body mass. We are typically able to do large range of movements around these levers, so our shoulder joints, our elbow joints allow us to do large movements, and of course, as I've mentioned already, the red bone marrow within the gaps in our spongy bone tissue here in the epiphysis is where red blood cells are produced, and obviously they're incredibly important for not only living but for sporting performance and aerobic events. So we have a lot of long bones in our body, often found in the limbs, and they are listed below. You will need to be able to identify them from pictures. So if a picture points to a sporting action and asks you to label that particular bone, you need to know what are the bones of the arms, the legs, the feet, and the collarbone is also a long bone. You might need to identify that they're long bones as well as just name them. Moving on then, another type of bone are short bones. Now these are obviously in contrast with the long bones we just talked about. These are small, compact, and actually they're almost square, so they're cube shaped. They are almost equally dimensional. You can perhaps see in some of these tarsals or these carpals, they are cube shaped. You could possibly remember these as being short bones being structured as square or cube shaped. That's a good connection to make. They're predominantly made of cancellous bone, so there's a little layer of compact bone around the outside, but the inside, we don't want them to be solid because they'd be heavy. They have a lot of spongy or cancellous bone, though that honeycomb-like bone tissue, and that keeps them very strong but very light. And the reason we need them to be strong is because they are essentially, particularly the tarsals in our ankle, are associated with strength or weight bearing and shock absorption. Okay, because they are cube shaped, there are lots of sides where joints can occur. They're not necessarily hugely for big range of movement, they're more for strength and for stability. So short bones are cube-like, cube-shaped or square-shaped, mostly spongy bone, so they're very strong and they do a lot of weight bearing. If you think about your little ankles and they have to carry your body mass, let alone if you jump where the force going down through them is huge, they have to contain that. Beware, because if you say like the small bones, the short bones of your foot or hand, that's not entirely true, because phalanges actually and metatarsals are considered long bones. It's the wrist and the ankle, the carpals of the wrist and the tarsals of the ankles, which are short bones. So try to be aware of that little misunderstanding. The third type of bone are flat bones. So these are quite distinct. They're not necessarily flat as in a piece of paper on a table flat, but they are predominantly flat. So structurally thin and flattened with possibly a slight curve. This you can see from some of the examples here, the scapula of the shoulder girdle, the flat bones of the cranium that are fused together, and the flat bone of the sternum in the front of the chest, the thoracic cavity here. They typically provide a large surface area. So they are not thick, they're not they're relatively thin. A sort of a sandwich of spongy bone tissue, 2 outer layers and an inner layer of spongy bone tissue. Now this surface area is really important because one of the functions of flat bones is to provide a space or a surface for attachment of connective tissues. And by connective tissues, we mean things like tendons of muscles and ligaments. So, for example, your scapula actually has a lot of muscles that are attached to it. Your sternum has muscles that are attached to it. Certainly parts of your cranium, not lots, has some muscles attached to it. The cranium, I'd say, is a good example of the other function of flat bones, which is to protect internal organs. And obviously the flat bones in the cranium protect the brain inside. The flat bone of the sternum is also very protective because here is your heart and here are your lungs. So the sternum is part of the protective mechanism of the thoracic cavity. The scapula is a really good example of how this flat bone is a large surface area for tendons and muscles to attach. So in total there are 29 flat bones in the body. Those, perhaps the scapula and the cranial bones or the sternum, is a really nice example. In actual fact, whilst you wouldn't think of it, the ribs have also been categorized as flat because they're quite narrow, I suppose, compared to others, but there is a flat element to them. But I'd say the scapula and the cranial bones are good examples of the two functions of flat bones. So the fourth of the 5 types of bones is a sesamoid bone. Now this is similar to a short bone, but it's a slightly rounder version. So it's not cube shaped, it's a more rounded type of smallish short bone. And we actually find sesamoid bones embedded in tendons, and they are designed to have a very smooth surface because of the job that they do. So let's have a look at the patella here. So this is the patella bone. This is a sesamoid bone, and it is embedded in the patella tendon. So this tendon that attaches on the tibia below the knee and above to the quadricep muscle groups. So this bone is designed with smooth surfaces because when you bend your knee constantly through the day, there is a rubbing action. What we want is this movement to easily happen. We don't want any friction, we don't want any wearing. So the patella bone is particularly valuable and designed structurally to reduce friction when movements occur. It also is there to hold the quadricep muscle away from the joint, which increases the angle, the pull of this muscle group. So it changes when the quadriceps contract and they pull on this patella tendon, by having that patella bone in the way, the angle is changed, and this makes it a more mechanically efficient pull. So the best and the easiest sesamoid bone to remember as an example is the patella, in the patella tendon. There is another one, the pisiform bone in the wrist. I think this is the diagram up here. Sorry, this is the diagram over here showing the pisiform. But I would suggest that the patella is the easiest one to remember. Lastly then, the fifth type of bone is irregular bones. So these basically are uniquely shaped. So the irregular bones have no consistency. They are designed for the particular job that they have, wherever this might be. Again, a thin layer of compact bone around some cancellous bone tissue, and very specifically designed for the specific locations. The easiest example would be the vertebral column. So each vertebrae is an irregular bone, and it is designed, you can actually see that the vertebrae are designed differently, so they are structured differently because in different locations up and down the spine they have different jobs, different functions. In this case, in this example, they have two functions. One is they are designed with a hole in the middle there, to protect the spinal cord, which runs up and inside the spine, up those gaps. Secondly, they're designed with different processes sticking out the back there because muscles attach to these processes. So protection and muscle attachment are two of the examples of functions of irregular bones. And I'd say that the vertebral column was the easiest way or easiest type to remember. The pelvic bones are actually also irregular bones, and some of the bones that make up your face, the small bones on the front of your skull, your facial bones are also irregular. So overall with this topic, you would need to be able to describe the different types of bone based on their structure. What are they built like? What do they look like? And you would need to connect their structure to their function. They're built this way to serve this purpose. And lastly, of course, you would need to be able to identify them on diagrams or images or sports images, but also to give examples yourself, even if there wasn't an image in place.